Hi everyone. Can everyone hear me? Thanks for coming to the Outreach Debate Weighing Lecture. This is the first part of our Fundamentals debate series where we break down like fundamental aspects of debate, including substance, and how to apply them further on to prog debate, which Adonay will talk about later in this lecture. My name is Nathan Lee. I'm the Director of Growth and the Alabama State Branch Director for Outreach. Adonay, if you want to introduce yourself.
Hi, my name's Adonay. I'm Nathan's partner at Northridge, and um, I just love to help with outreach whenever I can.
Sounds great. All right, let's get started. So, in this lecture, we're going to be doing four big things. First, we're going to be breaking down the basics of weighing. Based on the Google form that we sent out before this lecture, most people seem to be familiar with weighing, so we won't spend too much time on that. We will put some emphasis on the more advanced forms of weighing, like interactive mechanisms and comparative and interactive debate. And then we're going to focus on how to weigh under frameworks, which is really requested, and then also how to weigh on proc, which Adnan will do. And then before we go into frameworks, there will also be a drill session where you guys will actually be able to play a game called Impact Wars, which is really fun. All right. And at any point during this lecture, feel free to ask a question, whether you unmute or you put it in the chat. All right. So again, just based on like what we'll be going over, based on what you guys requested, was like meta weighing is a really big point of interest, weighing under frameworks and weighing under theories, Ks, etc. In terms of substance mechanisms, the more advanced comparative mechanisms were requested: strength of length, prereqs, link-ins, short circuits. We'll do all of that for you guys. And then when it comes to like theory mechanisms, everybody wanted that, so we'll do some of that as well. If there's anything else like specifically you want to request, feel free to ask. All right, so let's go on weighing. So what is weighing? Weighing is proving why one argument is more important than another, primarily your opponent's. And there's three basic components of weighing. First is the impact or link, or the function of technical debate, into how you are accessing weighing. Second is your mechanism, so magnitude, scope, severity, probability, any of the basic mechanisms that you're familiar with. And third is why you satisfy the mechanism better using using your impacts or links than your opponents. This is the most important part of weighing. It's called comparative weighing, and we'll talk more about that later. It can occur at the impact level, which most people are familiar with, but also at the link level, and also it can be used in any level of debate. So it's most common in substance, but when it comes to theory and K debate, even though it looks a little bit different, weighing is actually, as Adonay can tell you, probably the most important part of prog debates as well. So here are some common issues that we see in weighing. First is just saying mechanisms with no analysis. So if you like just say that we outweigh a magnitude and you don't explain how or why that's more important than your opponent's impacts on the flow, there's no reason for the judge to vote on you. When you're weighing, you should always be comparatively weighing, which means explaining why your weighing is doing a better job on that specific mechanism than your opponent's. Additionally, another common issue we see, especially in the NAT circuit, is just dumping weighing without any quality. So in my opinion, for example, 3 fleshed out mechanisms is always going to be better than 6 flippy ones. That's why interactive and comparative analysis for each mechanism is going to make it worthwhile on your judge's ballot. And third, like I said before, if you do non-comparative weighing, then that's going to be an issue. And fourth is not interacting with your opponent's weighing. So even if you're winning 3 like really great mechanisms on the flow, if you don't tell if your judge why it doesn't matter more than your opponent's weighing mechanisms, especially if they're different, for example, severity versus I don't know, like probability or time frame, then it's up to the judge to intervene in the round and decide on a winner like that, or decide on like an impact ballot that you don't have control of. So interacting with your opponent's weighing is something called meta weighing.
What's going on? I
What's up?
got you.
Okay, I'm gonna beat that guy. And also, if someone drops like your link or an impact, make sure to weigh that, especially when it comes to turns, which we'll talk about later, because that's one of the best ways to win. All right, so let's go over the basic common weighing mechanisms. You guys are probably familiar with it, so we won't spend too much time. First is magnitude, which can be broken up into 2 different types. There's magnitude through scope and magnitude through severity. Magnitude is a measure of an impact scale. And then specifically scope is how many or how much of your impact is being affected. An example is 100,000 lives from death or $200 trillion in investment. Additionally, within scope, there's a more specific type of scope weighing called scope of solvency or a solvency deficit. This is usually used offensively when you're trying to take out your opponent's scope weighing. The way you do this is to say that even though your opponents give you a giant impact in terms of scope, a great example is climate change, they're only solving for like 0.1%, right? A common one you'd see is that if we're trying to solve like 2.3 trillion pounds of carbon or tons of carbon emissions by 2050, they can only solve for like 0.3% of that, which means that it's not worthwhile in a judge's ballot. The second form of magnitude weighing is severity, which can be broken up into two types. For example, there's irreversibility and there's try or die weighing. The way you usually use those two is that if something is so severe that once it happens, it can't be reversed, that means that it always comes first on your ballot. And second is try or die weighing, which means that even if your probability isn't super high, the fact that your impact is so severe means it always comes first on your judge's ballot. And third, which isn't put here, is just like the traditional mechanisms of severity, which is like whether you're under SV framing or like the moral or qualitative reasons that the judge should be voting for you. Some examples include quality of life or suffering and trafficking arguments. Also, under extinction framing, you'd see death or like wide scale poverty under UTIL. All right. Next is probability, which is saying that your argument is more probable than theirs. An important distinction I want to make is that you saying your argument is probable does not mean that you're saying your argument is more probable than your opponent's. If you say your argument is some percent probable and your opponent says it's another percent probable, you're leaving it up to the judge to determine which is more probable. That's why, again, when you utilize comparative weighing or probability analysis, you write the judge's ballot by telling them why yours is more probable. Some good warrants for probability weighing include historical precedent or empirics or uniqueness analysis by saying that if one key fact at the top of the round is true, then nothing they say is actually going to happen. Third is actor analysis. For example, when you say that terrorists are more likely to start wars than state actors because they aren't bound to a territory or mutually assured destruction. And also just winning links, right? Like if you win that a certain event happens, then you can say that it's 100% probable. But if you lose that it doesn't happen, then you don't get to talk about the probability of that. All right. So next is time frame, which is two different types. First is short term, otherwise known as urgency, which is why your argument happens before your opponents and why it matters more. The second type is long term, which is why your impacts persist beyond your opponents. So both short and long term are often used to link into other forms of weighing. So you usually don't want to use time frame as its own weighing mechanism. So an example could be that short term weighing into extinction over war links into severity or scope or extinction. And then long term weighing can be linked best under, for example, structural violence framing into perpetual suffering, which then implicates out to severity or scope weighing, etc. All right. Then is strength of link, which is a little bit more complicated than general weighing mechanisms, and it can have multiple meanings. But usually we'd refer to strength of link to say that one argument has less defense than another, or that the link of a certain argument is substantially extended from or in front line into the back half. So this is basically a method of telling the judge that you're clearing on the flow compared to your opponents, and it's a great way to prove that like even if the weighing debate, which is arguably biased, is skewed towards the opponents, you're just being the better debater, and is a reason that you should vote for you. All right. So next, we go on to the more interactive weighing mechanisms that were highly requested. You can also think of them as just advanced weighing. All right. So first is a prerequisite, which means that your argument must happen for theirs to occur. So for example, on the March topic, if you're debating right now, an argument is that the economy can't prosper if the workforce is uneducated. That's a common neg argument, right? So quality education must be solved before the economy, which means that your argument is a fundamental prerequisite. And a great way to win the weighing debate is especially when you're losing on traditional mechanisms using prerequisite. For example, their severity and scope weighing, for example, assuming you drop their weighing, doesn't matter if you don't solve for our links first, right? So let's say that you're a second speaker and your first speaker didn't do a great job interacting with their weighing in summary. it's okay, because the way you can salvage the round in final is by saying that throw everything out the window, because if you don't solve for arguments, none of theirs matter. All right. Next is a short circuit argument. This mechanism is that if your argument happens, the opponent's argument doesn't happen. So if you debated September or November, a good example is that if Trump gets elected, any Democratic and liberal legislation that the app was usually advocating for wasn't going to happen. Or a standard one in extinction framing is that if we're all dead, we can't have a proper economy. Now, this is separate from a link-in, which is often confused with a short circuit. A link-in is that you solve for your opponent's impacts or links better. So this is absolutely important when you're weighing turns, because if you're usually winning a turn on their case, you're fundamentally doing it a link-in. You just don't know that's what it's called. So when you win a link-in, you also want to complement it with an additional weighing mechanism. So for example, you can say that you solve even better for their argument on severity if they're running an SV case, because we improve quality of life even more. So you never want to just leave a hanging link-in. You want to implicate using a different mechanism as to why you're winning the weighing debate on their side of the flow as well. All right. Then what I've been harking about this entire lecture, which is comparative weighing. So comparative weighing is probably the single most important thing that you can do in traditional substance and trad debates that can win you the round very easily. So here's what most teams do when they do non-comparative weighing. You just extend your impact and say, oh, we outweigh on scope. If you save X number of lives, we outweigh on magnitude because we're saving X impact. But you're not actually explaining to the judge why this matters more. Yeah. Really quickly. Short circuit for Daria Gurnani. Right, short circuit right here. So while Daria is writing that down, like I was saying, comparative weighing in contrast is going to be that judge, if we're solving for 100,000 lives, they're only solving for like 3,000, which means that at the end of the day, if you want to put magnitude at the top of your ballot, you're always voting for us, if that makes sense. And again, it's one of the easiest things you can do to win more rounds, and it's only like maybe one sentence more in terms of weighing. All right, then is meta weighing. Meta weighing is weighing, or a comparison of why your mechanisms matter more than your opponents. And it's good for when you may be losing the weighing debate, kind of like the prereq or the Lincoln arguments from before. And it's probably one of the most important aspects of debate you can learn, especially as to when you go to like higher levels of debate, especially on the NAT circuit. When teams get better, both teams start weighing. And at that point, you want to be able to compare which mechanism matters more. And here's some examples. So first is probability over magnitude. This is a standard like SV versus extinction situation. So infinite magnitude, for example, is pointless if it doesn't happen. A second argument is policy paralysis, which we'll talk about under extinction framing. It basically means that if we're so focused on huge impacts like nuclear war, we're never going to solve back for the real probable impacts like structural violence that are happening right now. And third is this argument that because of this, SV impacts or really probable impacts are always put in the back burner because we assume someone else is going to solve for them. Okay, second is if you're on the magnitude side. You'd say that probability weighing is interventionist because everybody has a different opinion of what's actually probable, right? Everybody has different political views, and unfortunately, no judge is actually a tabula rasa judge, and in the end, some people may have different biases. But what you can't be biased about is numbers, which is inherently probably the first weighing mechanism you learn in debate anyway, so that's an argument to be made there. Second is that if your impact is large enough, even a 1% link or chance of it happening means that it should always come first on your ballot. So like the standard 0.1% nuclear war situation. Also, we'll talk about this more on extinction framing, but there's also arguments that like people are biased against voting for super high magnitude, low probability impacts because everybody assumes they're being solved for, which means that you should actually put it on your ballot because it's being underrepresented. But next is urgency versus long term. So you'd say that urgency affects the most people at the fastest rate. You should be doing this when you know that you're winning the time frame debate in terms of short-term impacts. You can also say that to combat long-term impacts, intervening actors are always going to solve. For example, for nuclear war, we never need to worry about it because somebody, for example, in IR topics, China, Russia, or the United States, are usually going to prevent someone from pressing the button. Additionally, you can link in strength of link weighing to say, or that's actually for the strength of link, which I'll talk about in a second. But yeah, so then we'll go to severity versus scope. So again, this is commonly used in SV versus extinction framing situations. So for example, if you're trying to win SV, you'd say that one life that's trafficked or suffering is worse than their broad impact. And then you'd also say that one individual or group hurt can compound into generational suffering, which means that you're inherently linking into scope. And Melindu, yes, we'll have the slides open. I'll have the link in the chat after. And then in the contrast, if you're weighing for scope over severity, you'd say that solving for the most amount of people is the only fair way to relieve suffering. So that's like standard like utilitarianism arguments. Also, we'll talk about this later under framing debates, but prioritizing severity or suffering in one group is never going to solve for the broader picture. And this is a common argument, if you're familiar, called oppression Olympics. All right. Then, as I mentioned a second ago, another meta weighing mechanism is strength of link over other traditional mechanisms. So the argument that's made is that strength of link avoids judge intervention since it's the standard metric of who's winning the flow, right? In contrast, if you're trying to appeal to a judge's emotions using severity or a judge's like political beliefs based on the probability of a certain candidate winning, you're inherently opening yourself up to intervention by the judge. But something that's always fair and not biased is strength of link. All right. Let's move on to when to weigh. This is pretty standard. General rule of thumb, always weigh as early as possible. So in first rebuttal, the only really like opportunity you get to weigh is weighing turns, which you should be doing, especially when you have a whole 4 minutes to be doing that in PF. If you're in second rebuttal, when you're extending your own case in frontlining, start weighing there. Because it's a great way to set up interaction. And again, weigh your turns. In summary, it's basically the same as second rebuttal, but it becomes even more crucial. If, for example, your first speaker and your second speaker doesn't weigh in second rebuttal, it's not great, but you can probably still salvage the round by weighing in second summary if you're doing well enough on the flow. But if you don't weigh in summary, most judges don't like to evaluate weighing in final, and at that point you're in a pretty bad situation. So always weigh in summary. And assuming that your summary speaker did do well setting up mechanisms in the summary speech, by final, if you're a second speaker, you should be at this point collapsing down to the most important weighing. Ideally, some on your case, but also a large amount on turns on an offense on their case. Okay, so overall, if something is dropped, weighing that should be your priority, especially if it's on your case. And don't leave it for the end of the speech. I feel like a lot of students, when they first start debate, novices assume that it's like you should extend your case and then weigh the entire round in this one section after your extension, and then go to their case, which is completely untrue. Ideally, you should probably be interweaving weighing throughout like the frontlining process and throughout extending your case. And then in the second half of summary and second rebuttal speech, when you're extending turns on their case, you should also be weighing. And also another big issue to point out is that sometimes weighing between summary, or really between second rebuttal, summary, and final is inconsistent. When you're not communicating with your partner and you extend different mechanisms, that honestly doesn't really count as extending weighing. Because if you're not extending the same thing, then you're not giving the judge a consistent mechanism to vote for. So always be sure to communicate with your partner about forging a coherent narrative. Can you start meta weighing in final, says Dari? Yes. Preferably, if you're in a very like technical round and both teams are pretty good, enough weighing mechanisms will have been introduced. Let's assume in second final and then in second rebuttal and then first summary, to the point that you're meta weighing in second summary. Or if you're responding to the second rebuttal in your first summary, you could also start meta weighing there. So the same tenet applies to meta weighing as does regular weighing. Weigh and meta weigh as early as possible. Because at the end of the day, it's just a comparative of why the judge should be voting for your argument, whether it's a link or whether it's a weighing mechanism. I hope that answers your question. So second rebuttal can essentially fully weigh through summary, Daria asks. Yeah, right. So if you weigh in second rebuttal, then you're assuming this is what you're asking, then your second summary speaker should definitely just be reflecting that at that point. Right. So we're gonna do a quick drill. It's a game called Impact Wars, if any of you have heard of it before. So here's what we're gonna do. So impact wars is when you're gonna be provided an impact that are common in PF debate. So climate change, extinction, like economic downfall, any more that you want to think about, and then we're gonna basically have you do a mini debate. And the way that it's gonna work is that you get to use any mechanisms that you want, but only mechanisms, no links or no cards or anything, to win why your impact matters more. And then we're gonna like condense the timing down, so it'll be 2 minutes to one, give your impact, and then do weighing analysis, and then you'll have 30 seconds for cross, and then you basically give another speech like a rebuttal to it, or like a 2AC, like stating why your why their mechanisms are bad, two, your mechanisms are better, and then we'll just repeat another like a final session, which is going to be 1 minute long, where you collapse down on like the specific mechanisms you want to go for. So we'll do a couple rounds of these so that everybody gets a chance. So can I have 2 volunteers that want to go first? If you're not brave, I'm just going to pick people. Adonay, do you have anyone? You can pick the first person.
Um, how are you feeling over there, Hubert?
If you like really, really like don't want to do it, you don't have to. Okay. Hubert, do you think you can do one weighing drill? It won't be that hard, I promise.
It's all gonna be silly and chill. Like we're gonna pick fun impacts.
If not, we'll just pick someone else. Okay. How about we have Emily go? And one more person. Okay. We'll have Emily versus Vidika. How about that? Vidika, are you up for it?
Sure.
Okay. Vidika's brave. You're very tough. Okay, and Emily.
The things I do for you.
All right. We'll have these two people going. All right. Adonai, pick 2 impact scenarios for those two.
Will there be a decision at the end?
What's up, Daria?
Will there be like a decision at the end?
A what at the end?
Like a decision, like a result.
Oh, I mean, not really, because like it's just for educational purposes. Like all of this is just it's just a drill for everyone to learn. It's like no pressure, no judging. We'll just give feedback. How about that?
Let's do bee extinction and alien invasion, since that's one people always do to start out. How do we want to decide who gets what?
Um, I don't know. It'll be random. How about we do Vidika as first speaker and Emily as second? All right. So we'll give you, let's say, a minute and a half to prep, and then after that, you guys give your 1AC and 1NC, and that'll be 2 minutes long. Sound good? And we'll start that prep now.
Wait, so what am I?
Yeah, like which topic?
Girl, you can't just say first and second and not explain which one's which.
Oh, my bad. I thought Adonai specified. Okay, so Adonai, you said it's bee extinction and then what?
Bee extinction and alien invasion.
Oh,
Emily, do you want bee extinction?
yeah.
I do want bees.
Okay, cool.
And then Vidika, you'll be first speaking on alien invasion.
So I just like talk for like 2 minutes about like why alien extinction's bad.
Correct. And you
Okay.
can use any mechanism you want.
Doing, I hope.
Yeah, so like I don't know, severity, time frame, just my suggestions.
And like, it's a really broad scenario. So if you want to make it really specific to tailor something a bit more interesting, then do what you got to do to win.
Right. All right. I'll start 1.5 minutes on my timer now. Okay, and while they're prepping, if anyone else wants to just ask general questions, this is a good time. Oh, wait, my bad, I'm muted. Yeah, I'll restart. So, in response to Hubert's question, he asked, how do you weigh turns? And also, how do you weigh them in first rebuttal if you don't know what the opponent's going to say? So, the fundamental aspect of weighing turns in first rebuttal, even though you're blind to the second rebuttal's front line, is to just preempt and set up a good narrative. So, for example, on the March topic, if you're on the neg and you're winning that, if everybody's critical thinking decreases due to AI, we won't have a functional economy in the first place in a functional society. You can say, one, that links into any of their impact weighing in the future, but second, independently links into time frame and scope in the long term, because if more people are graduating school with less critical thinking, every graduating class that passes is only going to create a less cohesive society, which is ultimately worse in the long term. If that makes sense. All right, so that's definitely more than enough prep for Emily and Vidika. Melindu asks if there will be a recording. Yes, we'll post this onto YouTube. All right, Vidika, are you ready?
Yeah. Oh my god. Okay. This is
No pressure.
Okay. So can I just like start?
Yeah, 2 minutes.
Okay. So I'll start now. So, an alien invasion is really bad and it has a very high probability as one, we have a very massive universe. Earth is just one small planet in our solar system in a huge amount, it's huge universe. So, the probability of finding some other life forms is extremely probable. Whereas bees have been around for a very long time. Like the probability of their being completely extinct is highly low, as like not every single bee can like go around. You can go around, see like in your own backyard how many bees there are. How come every single one's gonna go extinct? It's highly improbable. Whereas like the mass amount of planets, there has to be some life. We're already finding life, and like what we're seeing and like aliens coming is like really probable. And then of course there's time frame that again, as we're going farther and farther, we're going to new planets, we're going to the moon, to Mars. We're seeing more and more. We're having more aliens, more invasive species. They're coming and we're seeing them right now. And the long-term effect of an alien invasion would be detrimental, as aliens can completely take over our entire planet and we would be completely lost. Whereas bees, we have survived before without bees, and we can survive again without bees. Even though that's improbable of happening, if it were to happen, we can survive. And the long-term time frame of that is not as big of a deal. And then of course there is magnitude, as an alien invasion would affect the entire universe, I mean entire Earth. We could be completely detrimental. We could lose all life on Earth and we would just have aliens. Whereas, again, bees not having that big of an impact because, one, it's improbable for them to completely go extinct. And even if they were to, we survived without bees before and it would not be a big issue. Because of this, it's like improbable that bees would be extinct. It would not have a big impact on the world in time frame. Whereas alien invasion, it's happening. We are going to new planets. We are finding new species, and this could definitely happen and have a huge impact. Yeah.
That was fantastic. Okay, Emily, are you ready?
Question. Am I just doing case or am I also rebuttal?
So this will be just case.
Okay,
It's
cool.
logical, constructive.
Okay. Okay, I'm ready. My time starts now. So the impact of bee extinction is extremely bad because it will cause the collapse of the Winnie the Pooh cartoon. Because without honey, then Winnie the Pooh can't like survive, and the beauty of Winnie the Pooh is no longer here. This is really important because we're winning this on severity. Because without Winnie the Pooh, then these children are going to be really sad, and everyone's going to be really sad because no one's going to get to see Winnie the Pooh anymore, which is really upsetting. That causes depression. This is really bad. It's extremely severe, and we outweigh here. We also went on time frame because Winnie the Pooh is really important in childhood education and helps childhood development. This is really important long term, as initial like childhood education is really key for future development, as like the childhood period is extremely important in terms of cognitive development. So long term, this would help education, and that also wins on magnitude because education, early education specifically, decreases future poverty, and poverty leads to death. This is most important. It would help thousands of kids, like Winnie the Pooh does. So if you get rid of Winnie the Pooh, these children aren't going to get that development, aren't going to be able to be helped education wise long term, and they're going to die magnitude. And we also win this on reversibility because of this death. If you let these kids not get their education, and oh, we scored a goal. Okay, not get the education that they need, they're going to fall into poverty. That's going to cause death. You can't reverse this death. It's most severe in the round. You have to prioritize deaths over anything else. We also went on probability because aliens won't invade. Like, we've been in this planet for forever. We have never seen aliens invade. They're just not going to invade. They just don't exist. Bees actually do. The probability of bees actually going extinct is higher. There's unique evidence now with climate change being extra back and stuff like that. And like everything with climate and pollution and whatever. So the bees are more likely to go extinct than any alien invasion would be. Therefore, you need to prioritize saving the bees.
Okay, very nice, Emily. We'll do a 30-second cross.
Okay. Okay.
You
So
can go first.
Okay. So is there anything like actually educational within Winnie the Pooh?
I think it was very educational, actually.
And
Okay.
do kids watch things other than Winnie the Pooh?
I think Winnie the Pooh is very important for many children and that we should not take away Winnie the Pooh. Can I have a question?
Yes.
Okay. Oh wait, it's 30 seconds. This is the shortest question here. Nathan, what do we do?
You can ask a question. You still have like 10 seconds, I guess.
Really? Okay, sure. You keep talking about how like we've survived previously without bees. When was the point in time where we didn't have bees?
Like the part in time when I mean we didn't survive without bees, like there's not like a massive amount of bees like everywhere in the world. It like used to be in like a really small corner.
Okay, cool.
Okay, very cool. To save on time, we reduced the speech times a little bit, so we'll do a 1 minute rebuttal for each, and then we'll do a 30-second one.
So like do I just like rebuttal right now or do I like get any prep?
We'll do 30 seconds of prep.
Okay.
Sound good?
Yeah.
No. All right, I think that's your prep.
Okay. I will start now. So, Winnie the Pooh, for one thing, this is completely non-unique, as Winnie the Pooh is not the only show available out there. There's many other shows that are far more educational than Winnie the Pooh. So, the loss of education would not be tied just to Winnie the Pooh. Furthermore, Winnie the Pooh does not use actual bees. Just because if a bee goes extinct does not mean that the whole Winnie the Pooh show will be completely lost. It's already been created in there and it's already there. So, like, children can already watch it and do as they please with the show. This show will not be affected by the loss of peas. Furthermore, they saw the claims on magnitude. However, only some kids are watching Winnie the Pooh, and this does not affect the whole world, whereas aliens would be the entire world. And then this going to poverty, again, this whole non-unique thing. Winnie the Pooh 1 is already still going to be out there, and it's not just kids watch other shows than that. And furthermore, Winnie the Pooh is not an educational show. There's far more educational shows other than that. And they said that aliens won't invade because, and like, of climate change, whatever. But bees, again, are still out there. We've had climate change for many years, and it's not had that big of an effect. So this is like not gonna happen.
Okay, great. Emily, when you do your speech, can you try to keep it on like the impact and meta weighing level versus like the links onto Winnie the Pooh, just
Sure.
to like demonstrate more weighing?
Give me like a second.
Yeah, we'll give you 30 seconds. How about that?
That works too. I don't know how long that was, but I'll just go now. Order or order? Question mark? My case? Their case? Okay. My time starts now. Starting on my side of the flow, where I'm clearly winning is on time frame, reversibility, and severity. Regardless of whether or not like a lot of people watch Winnie the Pooh, the point is that some people watch Winnie the Pooh and it would happen. We're winning this on severity because it would cause depression in these kids. They're not going to get their beautiful idol of Winnie the Pooh with his honey because it's just not going to exist anymore. This is extremely severe. It'll cause depression. So winning on time frame because even if one child is affected, it happens long term. Their development is going to be harmed long term. They're not going to get that figure. That's going to hurt long term education. It's going to cause poverty. That's going to cause death. On reversibility, we're winning this on the death. Their impacts have nothing about death. You have to prioritize something that's irreversible because once it happens, you're never going to get it back. We're winning this here. On their side, they try to weigh on like probability. Oh, we're also winning on probability because aliens haven't invaded. Bees actually exist and it's possible to go extinct, especially with climate change now. It's going to happen. Ours is far more probable. Prefer probability over any other impact. Sure. And time frame, they say they win on time frame, but that's not true because education is long term. Like we've never survived without bees. Bees have never just not existed. And yeah, prioritize probability.
All right, 30 seconds for the final, Vidika.
Okay.
Whenever you're ready.
Oh, sorry. Wait, so it's only 30 seconds?
Yeah.
Oh,
That's
okay.
It's gotta be like, so at this point, this for everyone, you should be collapsing down to like the most important aspect of the weighing debate. Because in context, right? This is a real final focus, you only get 2 minutes. But if you, let's say you spend 30 seconds extending like the one contention you're going for, another 30 seconds like extending turns on their case, another 30 seconds, let's say like contesting uniqueness or overviews, realistically you'll only have like maybe another 30 seconds to do the weighing debate, which makes sense.
Okay.
All right, whenever you're ready.
Okay. So ultimately, when we look at this debate, it's clearly that aliens win because of magnitude. When aliens do attack, it would affect the entire world, whereas bees won. Bees affecting going extinct would not affect the whole world. This is the whole Winnie the Pooh. Again, this is completely non-unique and would not happen. And even so, only a very marginally amount of children would be affected, whereas an alien invasion would cause deaths of the entire planet. And this magnitude of this far outweighs any argument that the other side can give you. So therefore, we win this debate.
Okay. I'm just gonna go. My time starts now. Where you should be prioritizing this round is probability. In reality, probability outweighs magnitude because that if it's never gonna happen, then it doesn't matter. The magnitude of it doesn't matter if it's just never gonna happen. Alien invasion is never gonna happen. We've never seen it before. Bees actually exist, and the probability of bee extinction is far more likely. Therefore, we're winning on probability. Therefore, their magnitude doesn't matter because you should prioritize probability. We also win on time frame because of the long-term effects of losing Winnie the Pooh and the reversibility of death. This goes uncontested. Therefore, you should prioritize bee extinction.
Okay, great debate, guys. All right, so we'll have some feedback. So first, I saw a good amount of comparative weighing from Verdika, which was great. I think honestly, from constructive, you did the comparative, and you were like, for example, on probability, there's a high probability of aliens happening because there's so many of them. But on that same metric, in contrast, right, bees becoming extinct has never happened before, and you think that it's very low probability. That's exactly what we're looking for in terms of comparative weighing, right? You have the same mechanism, and you're giving the judges under this scale who's winning what. Also, I think for everyone, it would have been better to see like more meta weighing earlier versus like all this like link debate on Winnie the Pooh. But I do get it, right? At least ultimately, like the point of this drill was to like have practice, right? Comparing like different impact scenarios. So even if it does have to do like Winnie the Pooh, I think it's good practice, and that was really good to see. And also, I think another great piece of meta weighing in the back half, honestly, in final, done by Emily, was like meta weighing probability over magnitude, right? Just like we talked about. Because if bee extinct or alien invasion never happens, which is probability, then the giant magnitude of an alien invasion doesn't matter, which is transferable to actual like debate scenarios when you're doing like IR topics, for example. All right. Any questions or any other advice from Adonay?
The main bit of advice I would have had would be to centralize Flash on the form of weighing that the other person isn't reading. Basically, if the 1AC, for example, both teams are going for probability and time frame on their case, at the point where you know that if you can at least keep that point of the clash on their side of the flow and just say, for example, our magnitude weighing matters more than every other form of weighing in this round because of X reason, then you've basically forced them to try to respond to everything on your case, including this prereq. And even if they win anything on your case, your meta weighing and building that up throughout the round would make it so that your case becomes a prior question to anything else on their side of the flow. Basically, just as the time gets smaller, you want to be more efficient with prioritizing what you have that they cannot access or haven't tried to access yet.
Okay, just some questions in the chat. So, Tejas asked, what does interventionist mean? Interventionist means that you're inviting, or not necessarily inviting, but the judge is finding a way to intervene within the round using their opinions and or logic that wasn't introduced by the debaters. So, like a great example is like, or like a simpler way to think of it is that the judge is letting their own biases like bleed into the round. But usually the difference between like, let's say a lay judge being biased or having different opinions versus a tech judge having to intervene is when there is no comparative mechanism offered by the debaters for the judge. So literally the reason why we weigh comparatively, right? For example, yeah, so the test is probabilities intervention is because some might think X impact will happen while it won't. Exactly, right? Or another way to think of it is that if you give like structural violence and you're weighing under trafficking, you'd say like this is a cyclical and severe issue, and your opponents are running like util and they're saying we're gonna win 100,000 or $100 million in investment, right? Those two are inherently non-interactive and non-comparative. The judge has no idea what to do with like cyclical suffering of marginalized groups and money for the economy, right? At that point, they have to intervene and just pick what they want to vote for. So even if the tech judge doesn't want to be biased, you as a debater, if you debate like that, are leaving them no choice, which is why you debate comparatively and interactively for the judge in the weighing debate so that you're setting up the ballot for them, if that makes sense. A great example of what of that happening in the past round was Emily saying that probability always comes first because giant magnitude impacts don't happen if they're never going to happen. All right. To save it on time, we won't do another drill session. If you have some time at the end of this lecture and you want to stay over to ask questions or do another drill session, we'll do that at the end. In the meantime, though, we'll go on to the more prog aspects of weighing. All right. I hope that was helpful, though. Okay, so let's do weighing under framing. Yeah, no problem, Tejas. Okay. So framing is basically like introducing like an auto preference of weighing into the round. So it's a reason why your arguments are always going to come first, and usually the best way to explain to the judge why your arguments come first is weighing. We won't like do a super deep dive into framing because we don't have a lot of time, and this is a weighing lecture. But if you want, like, if you have questions specifically, you can feel free to ask. So some general frameworks that are common in PF as of this past season on the NAT circuit are structural violence, and they materialized as genocide framing or standard women or gender framing, or just regular SV framing, which you guys are probably more familiar with. And the second most common form of framing is extinction. Extinction is when everybody dies, and it's more closely linked to util. If you're not familiar with what that is, util is the basic cost-benefit analysis logic we use in debate. So if you don't know what framing is, then you're using util framing. All right, so how to handle framing in the context of weighing? First is to contest their links or impacts into the framing. The more advanced framing becomes, especially in the NAT circuit, the more literature heavy it becomes. It relies on these authors that have thought deeply about extinction and structural violence scenarios, and in reality, they give very specific situations as to which a certain debate argument links into a type of framing. So don't just buy when teams say we're solving for structural violence because it has to do with minorities. That's not how structural violence works. For example, I won't go too deep into it, but essentially, structural violence is, in essence, a structural issue and a structural inequality that persists within an institution. So for example, in the September topic, if teams are running that human trafficking is SV because it has to do with minorities and like women being structurally hurt, that's not actually structural violence, because human trafficking is not an institutional issue. It's just an argument that impacts minorities. So the difference there is that if you can pinpoint to the judge that this doesn't satisfy the definition of SV, they don't actually have like access to that framework. That's like a more advanced like way of handling for framing, which we can talk about more if you have questions. But generally, just try to find plot holes or like logical holes within their framing warranty. Also, one of the best ways, if you're feeling lazy or you just don't want to weigh more than they are weighing, just link into their weighing, right? Like if you can solve back for their impacts best, then just make them your own. Also, if you're feeling like particularly productive, then read your own weighing, right? Like read your own framing, read your own meta weighing. This is probably the more strategic move to make, which is when you just like handle a completely different perspective in terms of framing. And then, like I said before, know the framing literature, because the better you know it, just like knowing your card and substance, the better advantage you can take of it. All right, so like we'll do SV and extinction, and if you have more types of framing you want to talk about, feel free to ask. Okay, so SV framing involves proving why some form of structural violence should be prioritized above everything else. When you're trying to read SV, the way you weigh this is using the following mechanisms. First, the severity or urgency or like long-term suffering. This general group of weighing has arguments that they're super severe, so like poverty or a form of suffering in a quality of life situation. You also say that because SV is ignored right now, it always has to come first on your ballot. You also bring in like moral arguments as to why dehumanization should be prevented in debate. Second is probability. It's one of the strongest suits of structural violence. It's one of the few impacts in debate that are actually happening. Minorities are actively being discriminated against. People are actively being trafficked. So if the judge is going to vote on something that they know is going to have an immediate, actual real-world effect, you want to make that argument in terms of probability. Then is a way to spike, which is where you're preemptively frontlining arguments you know the opponents are going to make, in which case it's going to be extinction when you're reading SV. You can say that even though they want to talk about this huge number that's common in extinction or util scenarios, you say that intergenerational suffering or cyclical suffering compounds to become a larger sum than the opponent's scope weighing. Again, this is a great example of comparative weighing because you're taking their mechanism but explaining why you're solving for it better. Another example, like I said before, like an example is that poverty and trafficking are cyclical. Okay, so Hooper asks, when you're running a framework, are you supposed to weigh based off the framework and not your impacts? So no. So when you're weighing anything in debate, it's going to be, in a substance round, it's going to be the impacts or the links. The framework, as is in the name, is just the framework as to which types of impacts and which mechanisms should be favored. So even if like you have a standard, like let's say like global warming impact, for example, under a structural violence framework, you're going to frame the round or that impact based on how it's affecting minorities. So in this case, you'd say that climate change affects the global south more, which is where minorities tend to live. In contrast, if you're framing the round based on an extinction perspective, you'd say that it's the best, climate change is the largest, most imminent threat in terms of human extinction, which is impacting the largest amount of people. That's the framework, i.e. perspective, that you're viewing the same impact through. So in a sense, frameworks are like lenses that you use to frame the round for the judge and the debate, the interactive debate, based using weighing as a mechanism. I hope that answers your question. Okay. Okay, so if you're then reading extinction and someone reads SV on you, how do you respond to it? So first are just link-ins, like we said before. Most impacts, you can make the argument that most impacts in debate are forms of SV. So in order to avoid oppression Olympics, which is where you say that if you solve for one group of people, then millions of others, or millions of other groups are just going to be put on the back burner. You say that instead, the best way to solve for everybody is to prioritize everyone. A second is that if you solve for large scale impacts, the people that are always going to be helped, indirectly helped, but also suffer the worst are minorities, right? So that climate change impact I just talked about, right? If there's climate change, the people that are hurt first are minorities. So by solving for the wide scale image of climate change, you're ultimately linking in to the opponent's SV argument about minorities. Or like here on the slideshow, pandemics disproportionately again hurt low income people like we saw during COVID. Again, by solving for pandemics on the wide scale, you're also inadvertently solving for SV. This is a good argument because it's inherently true. It just comes down to who wins the weighing as to, is it better to solve wide scale or is it better to target specific groups? All right, when you're doing this, as I said before, Lincoln should always be complemented by other forms of weighing, scope and severity are fail-proof. Right. Also saying that magnitude is greater than scope, this is just or magnitude is greater than severity weighing, is also just a standard extinction scenario, extinction tactic, right? Even if something has a 0.1% probability of happening, because it's so large, you should always come first. All right. Also, we can make moral obligation arguments, right? We need to survive as a human species. Okay. Then, if you're reading extinction in contrast, you need to prove why preventing extinction is the most important impacts. These are pretty intuitive usually. The mechanisms you use are scope. Killing everyone is a bigger impact than not killing everyone. That should also say severity after scope, right? If we're all dead, that's pretty severe. Magnitude times time frame as well, because extinction prevents future generations from being born, which means that if every single unborn family and generation that you're thinking of is also killed in the process, that's an unimaginably large scope. There's also an argument that's usually used in utility extinction frameworks from an author named Bostrom, who makes the argument that even an infinitesimally small chance of a large extinction scenario happening should always come first on your ballot. And then a prereq, right? We need to be alive to solve for anything else. These should probably all sound intuitive to you, because if you're an experienced enough debater, these are common arguments. But keeping these writing these down, or taking a screenshot of the screen, for example, and putting them to heart will make it easier for you to bring it up in the heat of a debate round, and ultimately make you a more reflexive and skilled debater. Okay. And if you're reading SV, how do you respond to extinction? First is flipping that Bostrom argument on probability. If something is infinitesimally unlikely to happen, it's probably not going to happen. For example, we haven't been wiped out by a giant meteor because it's unlikely to happen. Also, if you get into the literature, Bostrom's analysis says that everything has this a 0.1% chance of happening anyway. So at that point, you should just prefer what's actually happening. And what's actually happening is structural violence. Second is intervening actors. Nobody wants to die, which means that even if one group might try to push for nuclear extinction, for example, Russia, in an IR topic, there's going to be other people that are always going to stop that from happening, which means that there's no need for the judge to vote on it in a debate round, because some large country and their government is probably going to solve for it. Third is probability over magnitude. You can say that extinction is bad because if policymakers are so fixated with solving for very low probability arguments nuclear war, then other policies get put on the back burner, which is proven today by the fact that minorities still face unequal policy support and advocacy. Also, if you go into more advanced Nazi debate, you'll run into case terms on extinction called SPARK, which means that nuclear war is good. Stuff about bioweapons and unipolarity. If you don't know what that means, don't worry about it. If you do and you have questions, feel free to ask. Otherwise, we're going to move on. Sounds good. Okay. The last part of framing is pre-fiat discourse. Pre-fiat arguments are things that take place prior to the act of the judge evaluating the resolution. So these discourse arguments, theory arguments about specific things that supersede regular substance debate. You don't have to be too familiar about it. You can just think of it as like the concept that positive social norms are generated by discussing certain policies. So usually like the rhetoric associated around pre-fiat framing arguments is that we said this impact matters, and because we said it like verbally, we should win the round. So that might sound kind of silly, but in terms of theory and norm setting, it is pretty popular, especially on the NAT circuit. It's usually run as an underview. And if you want to use this personally as a debater, you need to be really familiar with the mechanisms of theory and discourse-based stuff. So if you are familiar with theory, I'm sure Outreach is going to do a lecture on that later. Maybe I'll do it with Adonay, who knows? And you should definitely come, because then we'll teach you like how to utilize that. But as of now, just kind of know it, and then probably like find out how to respond to it. And then so the primary links on these kinds of arguments is like all the theory impacts that we'll talk about later. So like discourse, education, fairness, and safety. These are all like impacts, and then weighing mechanisms of themselves. They're called voters, which are basically the impacts and weighing associated with theory. Also, most like discourse-based underviews need to be handled immediately after being read. So if you ever run into an argument which is like they must respond in the next speech because of time skew, etc., that's usually what they're talking about. If you're not familiar with like this aspect of framing, that's okay. Okay, so weighing theory. Adonay, would you like to take this?
I'd love to. Okay, so honestly, it is some judges will, to answer your question, Solomon, some judges really don't like the idea of it being read in the underview. So yes, it is technically TKO, but at the point where it's just being treated like a trick, you're not really following the K like following the underview. The point of the underview is to create discourse around SV, and if you cut the conversation about SV short so you can win a round, then you really shouldn't be getting the discourse offense. So I would not call for TKO because it just runs counter to the same reasoning behind it.
Yeah, I also think you need to know your judge, because discourse stuff is like, especially when run in frameworks, is very like you're like playing with the line from like actual theory to like Friv theory. So like not many judges will like want to vote for it as much. So you need to know their margin for like what they consider Friv theory. If like they're like a full tech and they will vote for it, then like by all means, I guess call TKO. But you have to be certain that like they will vote off that mechanism. Otherwise, it's better to just go for substance, because I'd say like in my opinion, 70% of people again have like a bias against like Friv or like discourse-based arguments within framing. That's very, in terms of K's, that's a completely different story. But when in framing and like IVI based like underviews, I'd say most people are like opposed to it. So you need to know your judge very well.
In that case, so we're going to start out just with a little quick overview of what a theory shell looks like. So is anyone here not familiar with theory shells or their applications in PF? Okay, cool. Let's go over it then. Nathan, do you mind going to the next slide?
Yeah, really quickly, Cooper, did you say you are familiar or you're not? Okay, Melinda's not. Okay, that's fine. We'll do like a really quick breakdown. If you're not familiar with theory as a whole, this section won't be as like beneficial to you. So Adonai, what we'll probably do is just like not spend too much time on it, but just also give them a rundown of like what theory is.
Yeah. So theory has basically five larger parts. First is the interpretation. It's generally a positively phrased statement that outlines a norm that should be followed in the debate space, specifically in round. It's like debaters must disclose their case on the NDCA wiki for X year, 30 minutes before the round. The violation is the harm committed by the opponent that's run alongside the interp. So basically just right below it, a screenshot of their wiki. Standards, it's reasons why the interp is good and violating it causes harm. So for example, like a time skew or a strat skew, and then paradigm issues or voters are basically the final impact of this like shell through the lens of fairness and education. The underview just tells the judge how to handle this form of offense. and it either involves dropping the debater or dropping an argument, whether theory is offensive if responded to or not. So the concept of RVIs. Um, does anyone have any questions before we move on to weighing within each part? Okay, in that case, we're going to move on. So the first concept we're going to go over is weighing standards. So the main forms that you're going to see are first, prereqs, just asking whether the standard created by the 1AC or 1NC and the norms that it violates are a prior question to either a counter standard, so the way you respond to a shell, or vice versa. So for example, if a shell has a strategy skew of another team not disclosing their case, then the prior question there could be like, okay, accessibility and any other standard read by the other team is now going to lie as this now lies as a prior question to that, because you can't have X, for example, you can't have accessibility if there are strategy skews towards other teams. Mainly what you're going to see, though, are weighing through the lens of education and fairness, so our voters. The way people try to warrant out education is that debate is a school-centric activity because of large amounts of groups. That's just who participates within it. And it's funding. What? If you have any questions, just drop them in the chat, but I'm just going to keep going. So funding's allocated with the assumption that students will gain some sort of educational value from the activity and from participating. So when you compromise education in this space, schools will be more hesitant or just outright pull funding from debate as an activity. So for example, practices that it's perfectly fine. So practices in round, such as like constantly reading friv shells or reading joke cases, might discourage schools from actually wanting kids to participate, because what they're really looking for out of the activity is discussion of policy, economics, and just making kids more confident in discussing issues that they are going to have to know as adults. The second aspect that people weigh on is fairness, since debate is fundamentally a game played by students, and there's this idea of collective consent in playing that's created through accepted norms. Like, for example, that you have to have cut cards ready when presented, or that you have to not interrupt other people's speeches, for example. That keeps the space relatively fair. Now, I use the word relatively because norms are different from circuit to circuit. Like Nathan and I, when we debate in Alabama, disclosure is not a norm there. But on the NatCirc and, for example, in Texas or Florida, it's much more normal for people to have to put their cases up on the wiki or email them before round. So fairness is a bit more relative. Education is pretty easy to win, but theory is fundamentally like debate. It's a game. The better you know it and the more you practice it, the better you'll get at this form of weighing.
If you let me take over for a really second. So like
to
summarize like the in-depth parts that Adonay gave. Overall, since you're not like since most of us aren't super familiar with theory in this lecture, we'll just say that like overall, right, if theory is a way to debate about the fairness of debate and how included people feel in this activity, then the voters, or weighing the voters, which are like education and fairness, as Adonay talked about, will function the exact same way as a substance debate. We just put different names for the impacts and the mechanisms. And instead of talking about like pretend scenarios in terms of policies that might or might not actually going to be implemented, we're talking about how real people are being impacted. So in a way, weighing theory is way more intuitive than weighing in substance debate, because it's literally like, what am I as a student and competitor in debate like feeling, and like how am I being impacted in this activity? So it's much more like real world, if that makes sense. Okay, it's like Adonay, if you can quickly go over like paradigm issues and stuff like that. You're muted.
So paradigm issues or voters, just back to that concept of education and fairness. This is mainly just going to be prereqs. So interaction between whether can you have education if a debate is not fair? Can you have a fair debate if there's no education and no school wants to participate? And it just goes back and forth. You might have a few link-ins to kind of develop that prereq. So for example, when it comes to the probability, whose policy or whose side is more likely to sustain the debate space or make it educational or fair, and how long would that take? Does that mean that students are experiencing these outcomes after leaving the debate space, or is it a matter of them having to stay with it for years upon years for you to actually see that impact? Short circuits are just a variation of a prereq. It's that whose advocacy could solve for the other or trigger the other. So if I have an educational debate, does it immediately become fair, and vice versa? So the underview, we're not really going to be able to get into a crazy amount here, but it just boils down to what scenario is best for retaining the debater and reforming the behavior that you don't like. So this really just goes down to the three separate warrants. First is norm setting. Debate is a game, so wins and losses dictate how you decide to behave. A loss of an incentive for better behavior in future rounds occurs through the fear of loss or further loss in the future. So again, back to that same paradigm of probability and time frame. Does punishment in one round decrease the likelihood of bad behavior? And in time frame, does that mean that you see a quick shift, or does that mean they just leave the activity because they don't like it? The other two warrants at the bottom are just for trying to determine whether theory is offensive or defensive when you're responding to it. So frivolous theory is generally a warrant for saying that we need to have theory as an offensive form of substance. So basically, if someone reads theory on me and I respond to it, I should be able to win the round because I responded to it. And that's because if I can just read infinite amounts of shells and you don't respond to one and I immediately win the round, then you're going to quit the activity because it's not fun. That's why RVIs exist. It just stands for reverse voting issue. So you win because you respond. Well, baiting goes on the other side of that and saying that we shouldn't have reverse voting issues because you shouldn't win a game by proving that you're fair. So it's the idea that people who are really good at theory could just behave badly in round, wait for you to read a shell, and then win on it, which is kind of shaky footing because that's how all substance in debate works. And it's a matter of to win theory, you have to prove that your norm is good. And if you can't prove it's good, you really shouldn't be getting offense from it anyhow. But it really just goes both ways. And these warrants are generally just memorized and flushed out more later in round. But we could probably get into theory in another lecture in greater detail.
Yeah, that's a good point. Is like this is like more like mechanics of theory and stuff, and if you're not familiar, it's probably not making that much sense right now, which is totally fine. On that same track, we have prepared like a lecture section on like weighing critiques. But does anyone here like actually like find themselves like familiar with critiques? Like, does anyone here actually know them? Because if not, there won't be much use in talking about weighing critiques. It's better to go to okay, Solomon does. If you don't know about critiques, a great place to learn about them is in Oliver Alfernus's lecture tomorrow. Oliver is like one of the like he's like ranked like 9 in the nation, like very successful in the NAT circuit, and he'll be doing a K lecture as part of our outreach lecture series. So if you don't know, then I encourage you to go to that. Okay, so Solomon knows. Does anyone else? Not really. That's fine. Okay, well, for Solomon, Adonay, if you could like briefly go over it, and like there's like a specific part you're really interested in, Solomon, just like put it in the chat, and Adonay will focus a little more on that.
Yep. So just a quick overview of what a critique looks like. There's 4 parts. It's the link. So whatever actually happened in the round or was read in the round that is causing some sort of harm outside of this debate simulation. The impact is just your literature for your K that explains why that thing is bad. The alternative is what you do to change that. In PF, we don't have counter plans, so you can't really take any policy action. So most of this is just going to be discourse or what's happening in round between you and I talking and how that could change the world. Roll the ballot is just how the judge should evaluate the positions read in the round because of the K. Any questions about those parts? Okay, in that case, we'll move on to weighing the link. So you might recognize this structure. It looks a lot like weighing standards from theory shell because it is. So prereqs for this are pretty simple. It's whether the harm created can be solved back by doing the opposite position. So for example, if I'm reading a K and another person is reading SV and they're reading positions like not focusing on minorities is bad, then something within my K or solving back for the way the SV shell was approached could be better than just trying to address SV outright. And that's kind of where you fall back on your literature to try to prove why your stuff matters more. This also gets into interaction with theory as well, because people read a lot of stuff like it's unfair to read a K with a roll of the ballot with an alternative because there's no counterplans. And that's kind of where you get this big overarching theme in K debate, where it's procedural fairness, so the way we normally debate, versus accessibility. So should we be including other ideas, other concepts, and discussing the struggles of minorities within the space and outside of it? So Lincolns function two different ways. Lincolns, I generally wouldn't recommend them because people usually have literature that preps it out to a T. But if you want to do them, it's simple probability, which scenario is going to cause the least amount of harm, or try to get on the right path to solving it. So does Nathan and I talking about nihilism actually put it out into the world, or does some sort of policy action that's getting in that direction in this round have a better impact because more people will talk about that policy action rather than the K? So time frame, pretty simple. Which one has a more pressing timetable? So someone is going to die tomorrow versus someone's going to die in the next 3 years. And that's kind of the same idea of a K. So if society is going to collapse according to some like neo-Marxist K, how long is it going to take for that to happen relative to the oppression of some minority, for example? Then it's also this idea of harm over time that a lot of Ks rely upon. So current state of society, really bad. That's usually what Lit for Critique says. And the idea of whose harm is going to be the worst across the next few years, weeks, months, just that in its concept. Short circuits are a lot more common. It's whose advocacy could trigger a better form of solvency for another. So, does implementing a governmentless world or taking away capitalism make lives better for minorities or smaller groups? This is really where you'll see a lot of the weighing because the alternatives are just discourse and the role the ballots are made to shape around them. But we'll go through those really quickly.
Yeah, like if you can do this like really quickly, Adonai, since most people aren't familiar with it, we'll focus more times for question and drill at the end.
Roll the ballot, really simple here. Whose roll of the ballot improves discourse the most? So are you shifting it really towards trying to win the round, or are you trying to actually open it up for conversation? For identity Ks, usually you want to reference back to your literature for practices that reduce accessibility that exists now or push an echo chamber effect. For safety, people usually try to use this to get out of certain roll of the ballots on identity Ks that push a very uncomfortable scenario in the debate space. So the idea of ensuring psychological, physical, whatever, the health of the people participating in the activity. The role of the ballot, if you're reading the K, should be to ensure that it conforms to your positions, not to ensure some form of reciprocity and make it fair. Because at the end of the day, you're just trying to get a message out and win the round. You're not necessarily trying to have that conversation. But it just depends on what you want to do. Weighing here looks less like weighing for case positions because it's not as mechanical. It's more about being interactive with what your opponent is saying and trying to simplify your literature because everyone in the country is going to know what the PF topic is if they're doing debate. Not everyone will know this K that you decided to cook up with a couple of your friends. So it's just about being as simple as possible. The alternative, we'll just move on to weighing the alternatives because it looks really similar to roll the ballot. It's really simple. So here, same thing as the link, prereqs, whose alternative is better at solving the other person's problems, which alternatives comes first. Lincoln's pretty simple here. Which alternative is more likely to work? Which alternative takes the least amount of time, prevents the most suffering? Short circuits, again, the same idea of does my alternative in turn trigger yours? Does yours trigger mine? How's the interaction between my harm being solved and yours being solved. So a bit rushed, but if you want to learn about the K, there's a really great lecture happening tomorrow, and I encourage you to attend.
Okay, so back to like substance and probably stuff people know more about. So how do you get better at weighing? Whether it's any of the 4 types we talked about today. So a couple drills you can do is to first outline an entire link scenario on like a given topic. So like set up a practice debate, kind of like the drill we did, and then figure out the interaction between each part. So whether you're going for like link turns and you're weighing those, or you're going for impacts, etc. Second, make use of the friends and teammates you have. So literally do the drill that we just did today with your friends, and then just keep drilling constantly. I promise you, even though it seems rudimentary, just repeating those same practices will really be helpful. Also, try a rebuttal with only weighing, so like no links, because especially if you were like a tech debater first, if that was what you were taught as a novice, then people become really reliant on just like link level substance debates. But really, if you want to do well in any form of debate, weighing is going to be your best friend. So trying to prioritize that in your drills will really get you to a better win rate. And then also, like just like flow around from a video. There's like tons of them on YouTube. PF videos, I believe, is a really good resource and channel online. And then just try to like weigh each like alpha and neg argument for yourself without watching like the rest of the video, and then see how the people in that video decide to treat the round. Okay, that's all for this lecture. Does anyone have any questions? Sounds good. So it's like a brief overview about what Outreach is, although I assume that most people are part of it. Outreach is an international nonprofit who try to give accessible and free resources to everybody. This lecture is one of those resources. We've got a lot of stuff coming up, but most importantly, if you want to learn more about prog debate and K debate, make sure to go to Oliver's lecture tomorrow, and join our Discord if you haven't, which is linked in the slide. All right. In that case, if nobody has any more questions, thank you all so much for coming, and we'll see you next time whenever we have a lecture. Also, the slides should be shared in the chat. Let me know if you need it again, and we'll post this video to YouTube as well.